in Washington.
And on Wednesday, a national day of mourning. Family, friends, dignitaries, all alike will come together for a state funeral. Another funeral service to be held Thursday in Houston, Texas, where the former president lived. Then he will be laid to rest at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library beside his beloved wife, Barbara Bush. When George Bush passed away on Friday, he was surrounded by friends and family.
Among them were his son Neil Bush and his wife Maria, his best friend, former Secretary of State James Baker, and his grandson Pierce Bush. His son and grandson spoke with reporters shortly after Mr. Bush died.
His sense of service with humility, giving credit to others, lifting others by looking for the best in others, those real character values that are so deeply embodied in him are what I will carry forward with me. Pierce will carry, all of the grandkids and the siblings of George H.W. Bush, and I think many Americans have been influenced by his positive example. So I'm not mourning, I'm celebrating a life so beautifully well lived.
He had a heart for lifting up others, always had an ability to put himself in the other guy's shoes to an extent that I wish more humans could do, because I think the world would be a much better place. So I'll remember so many things about my grandfather, but most of all, I'll remember him as the world's greatest grandfather.
It was sweet that they came out and talked with people.
Yeah, it was.
As the end drew near, former President Bush was increasingly weak. He had a form of Parkinson's disease and congestive heart failure.
And we've learned of his last words, those last words to his son, the former president of the United States, George W. Bush. Our special correspondent, Jamie Gangel, has this report.
We've learned a lot about the final days and the final moments of former President Bush's life. We've been told that in his final hours, he was surrounded by his family, his son Neil Bush, his grandson Pierce Bush, and his best friend James Baker. But we've been told that his final words were actually over the phone. There was a speakerphone in the room, and he was speaking to his son, former President George W. Bush, who we call 43. And his son said to him, "Dad, you've been a wonderful father." And President Bush Sr. responded, "I love you too." And those were his final words before he passed. The story is also very poignant because there is endless fascination about the relationship between these two men. Each one of them used to say to me, "Jamie, don't ask about our relationship. We're not into psychobabble." But the fact of the matter is they were very close. And we recently spoke to former President George W. Bush about their relationship.
It was a wonderful party.
Give me some words to describe your father.
Humble, driven, competitive, willing to listen to the other person. He's a great listener, thoughtful, and a person who cared deeply about others who hurt. One of the more very dramatic moments for me came on September the 14th at the National Cathedral. I was very fearful of bursting out in tears, and the country didn't need to see a weeping president. Finished the speech and went back to the pew and sat down. And I felt his hand reach across Laura and grab my arm. Just a small gesture, but it meant a lot to me. It was a very sweet moment of fatherly love.
We know that President George W. Bush, the son, in fact, will be one of the eulogists this Wednesday at that same place in the National Cathedral. The Bushmen are known to be emotional, that they cry easily, and no question when he is memorializing and celebrating his father's life on Wednesday, it's going to be a very emotional speech. Jamie Gangel, CNN, Washington, D.C.
Let's bring in presidential historian Mike Purdy now. He's from Seattle, Washington. It's good to have you with us, Mr. Purdy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, I believe you have said that politics did not come natural for Mr. Bush, but he pulled it off, didn't he? What was it? What did he have that helped him succeed?
He pulled it off. He was at the right place at the right time many times. He was, of course, helped by his patrician upbringing. His father was a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, and Bush seemed to just rise at the right point at the right time. But what he lacked is what he called the vision thing. And he was known for his being adept at foreign policy, but less so at domestic policy, which is one of the things that probably sank his reelection hopes. He was seen as out of touch with the common people. There's the classic debate in 1992 where he's asked, what's the impact of the recession on you personally? And he was very defensive and gave a non-answer, whereas Bill Clinton was really empathizing with the questioner.
Yes, I remember during his presidency, I was anchoring at CNN back then. We didn't see him that much on the domestic front. But then again, he rose to the occasion internationally. We certainly know his achievements there with the reunification of Germany and taking back Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. He was a true Republican, but he governed in the era of compromise and collaboration, didn't he? I mean, he personally pulled together the coalition for the Gulf War.
He certainly did. He was a great collaborator, consensus builder. He lived in an era where there was more civility in government. And he saw government as service, and he devoted so much of his life, so many of his years to service. And it's very different today, of course, isn't it, where civility and compromise and consensus are kind of dirty words, and they're not used. It's a very polarized world we live in today. So Bush, in some ways, is kind of one of the last of these statesmen who was able to develop these coalitions.
Yes, you got to wonder if the Republican Party can ever find another person kind of like George Bush. You would think maybe we could get there. I want to ask you, though, what do you make of the friendship that emerged, speaking of a different era, between Democrat Bill Clinton and Mr. Bush? And what lessons can we learn today from that era, Mr. Bush's civility and his decency as well?
Right. Well, and I think your word decency is what I would use to characterize Bush most, that he had a basic common sense of decency. And I think it's a very heartwarming story of Bush and Bill Clinton's reconciliation, and actually more than reconciliation, a very deep friendship that developed between them after their presidencies. And this comes after, you know, a very bitter 1992 campaign where Bush called Clinton a bozo, and it was not a good campaign. And sometimes in the heat of politics, people say things that maybe they don't mean to say. But I think it shows that this reconciliation between Clinton and Bush, that we can work together. We can work together across political ideologies.
Well, as a presidential historian, I know you have a book coming out. It's titled Fathead, 101 Insults by the Presidents about the Presidents. There are that many insults out there. So I think that President Bush might have had something negative to say about the current president. He not only called Clinton a bozo, but talk to us about the insults between presidents.
Yes. So there's actually more than 101. I'm just keeping the book to 101. Maybe there'll be another book coming out with more. But Bush's opinion of the current president was not good. He called President Trump a blowhard. And in fact, you've got Bush, who is the former Republican Party chair, a Republican through and through his whole political life. And yet in 2016, he did not vote for Republican Donald Trump. He voted for the Democrat Hillary Clinton. But we've seen insults between presidents throughout our history. Donald Trump did not invent the art of the political insult, but he has certainly brought it to a much higher, more vitriolic level than we've ever seen before. You can look at some between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson was certainly not good. William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt in the 1912 campaign was pretty vitriolic. The title for my book, Fathead, comes from the fact that that's what Theodore Roosevelt accused Taft of being, in addition to saying he had the brains of a guinea pig.
That's a good one. I look forward to that book. That's kind of the era we are in right now, insults. And that's why it's rewarding to talk about Mr. Bush and the kind of person he was. And we appreciate so much you joining us and sharing your thoughts with us. Mike Purdy from Seattle. Thank you, Mike.
My pleasure.
That's interesting, Natalie. The insults, they went back and forth, but at the same time, you did find these presidents had a relationship beyond, you know, the rhetoric, and it's definitely something that is nice to see. As we just heard, George H.W. Bush had a special relationship with his successor.
It will delay hiking tariffs on Chinese goods, at least for now. That's what came out of a 2-hour dinner between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Argentina. China agreed to buy more U.S. goods, while both sides work toward a comprehensive trade deal over the next 90 days.
Also hearing from the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, saying that he and Mr. Trump talked briefly on the sidelines of the G20, even though Mr. Trump had canceled that formal meeting earlier. He said they discussed the recent confrontation between Ukrainian ships and the Russian Navy. So some big issues discussed, and we are following both angles this hour. CNN Stephen Zhang live in Beijing, and our Matthew Chance live in the Russian capital of Moscow. Stephen, let's start with you on the progress that seems to have been made between these leaders on tariffs. Now, rather than more tariffs, it seems they're putting tariffs on ice.
That's right, George, but it's a pause in escalation, not in the trade war. Remember, the existing tariffs from both countries on billions of dollars of imports from each other, they're still very much in place. Now, they say the devil is in the details. The one detail a lot of people will be focusing on in the coming months is that 90-day negotiating period you just mentioned, because these talks will focus on the core demands from Mr. Trump. That is, China needs to change its economy structurally and stop its unfair trade practices against the U.S. Now, that means China needs to not only buy more from the U.S., but also to stop stealing U.S. intellectual property and stop subsidizing its companies and industries. These are the points long resisted by Mr. Xi and his government, because they view this as a strategic move by the U.S. to stop the global rise of China. So at this juncture, it's still very difficult to envision a mutually agreeable permanent solution to this issue, given how far apart both sides have remained. But, you know, Mr. Trump wants the market to rally, and Mr. Xi is said to be under mounting pressure domestically because of the slowing economy here. And some would also argue he's probably just buying time. But no matter the reasons, George, at least in the short run, this temporary deal will probably make a lot of people breathe a sigh of relief, not only investors, but also American farmers, Chinese manufacturers, as well as consumers around the world. George.
All right. Certainly it is a change from what we've seen before. Stephen, thank you. Now our colleague Matthew Chance. Matthew, the president said that he canceled his official meeting with the Russian president, as he said, because of what's happening in Ukraine. But we do understand through Mr. Putin that Mr. Putin made his position known to President Trump. So they did speak. Again, we're hearing from the Russian president.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there was always going to be, despite the fact that President Trump cancelled the planned 2-hour head-to-head meeting between him and President Putin of Russia, there was always going to be impromptu opportunities at this gathering of world leaders in Buenos Aires, where Presidents Trump and Putin would come into contact with each other and even exchange remarks. There was some disappointment expressed by the Kremlin initially when they saw this tweet extraordinarily from Donald Trump saying that meeting had been cancelled because of the naval confrontation in Ukraine. They'd initially brushed it off. They then issued a statement saying that the fact that they're not sitting down to discuss these important issues between the two countries could lead to more tensions around the world. But there was an opportunity, we're told now, by the Kremlin for these two leaders to exchange words. Take a listen to what Vladimir Putin said was discussed.
Of course we were there. We talked to each other. I had a brief talk with President Trump, and I answered his questions about the Black Sea incident. He has his position on that, and I have mine, and we didn't change those positions. But I informed him about how we view the incident. I think it's a pity we didn't succeed in having a full-fledged meeting, because I think the time is ripe.
Right, well, the Russians have also said, look, you know, we still are keen for a full-fledged meeting moving forward. They're still expecting to have a head-to-head meeting at some point in the future. One of the other issues, of course, that wasn't discussed and may well be the real reason for this cancellation is the fact that Trump's business dealings in Russia have once again fallen under the spotlight with revelations from his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, that actually negotiations to build a Trump Tower building in Moscow went on much longer, well into the presidential campaign, than had previously been admitted. And so that's added additional pressure on President Trump in terms of this Russia investigation.
Though it seems the Russian president controlling the narrative coming out of the G20 and the questions of Russia, Matthew, continue to loom large here in the United States. Matthew Chance, live for us in Moscow. Stephen Jiang, live for us in Beijing. Gentlemen, thank you both for the reporting. We'll keep in touch with you.
Let's talk more about what they've been discussing with Scott Lucas. He teaches international politics at the University of Birmingham, England. Scott, thank you for being with us. Certainly, President Trump canceled a news conference because of the death of President Bush. So that may be why we're hearing more from the Russians than the Americans right now. But the big headline, the U.S. and China arriving at a tariff truce, or as Stephen just said, maybe a pause in the escalation. How important was this breakthrough?
It makes for an important headline, but it's not an important breakthrough. And let's be very clear here. What both sides wanted was a photo out of the G20 and some type of statement to say that we were not going to a full escalation of the trade war. But if you look at what was actually agreed, it wasn't very much. And that is the White House has said on its side, it's going to delay a rise in the tariffs, not a removal of the tariffs, but delaying a rise in the tariffs from 10% to 25% on Chinese products. That was due on January the 1st. On its side, China has said, okay, we'll buy more U.S. products, but has given no specific amount. And to add to all this, what the White House has said is, okay, we're going to renew trade negotiations on issues like intellectual property, on the claims that the Chinese have been stealing technology. If we're not happy with those negotiations within 90 days, we're going to go ahead and resume the 25% tariff level. So it is a bit, and I think your correspondents had it right, a bit of breathing space right now because these tariffs have affected both sides, especially agriculture in the United States, and it was rattling the markets and investors. So at least for a couple months, we see if the trade talks can go anywhere, and we hope that both sides, especially a man on his Twitter feed, can refrain from inflammatory statements.
Yes, and there are negotiations to be had for sure in this story. We'll continue, of course, to follow it. But President Trump, as far as meetings with other leaders, he avoided the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and Vladimir Putin. We know they talked informally. And in doing so, he did not tackle head-on the death of Mr. Khashoggi, the journalist, or Russia's dealings with Ukraine at a certain depth level. Was that a missed opportunity?
Oh, it's just because Donald Trump was effectively boxed in. Look, let's be very clear. I mean, the Russians have put their statement out today, but their priority was not a one-on-one between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. They're a bit irritated he got canceled quickly. But what they're looking to do is to box Trump in, for example, on Ukraine. Now, what they have done is not only continued to hold the Ukrainian ships and the sailors that they seized recently, but Vladimir Putin this morning is reportedly saying that a war, and he did call it a war, with Ukraine will continue as long as the current government's in Kiev. And that's sort of, okay, what are you going to do about it? And remember the other dimension you referred to, and that is that the United States, specifically Donald Trump, has given up any leverage over Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And that means that pressure for a ceasefire in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is a key player in that conflict, that's gone. There's one image that will stay with me from this G20, and that is, of course, on the first day, when Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman high-fived each other and had effusive smiles.
Right.
If you look very carefully behind them, there's a guy who isn't smiling, staring, going, what's happened to my two best friends? That man is Donald Trump.
I saw the picture. I want to talk to you about one thing that is being said that the president, Mr. Trump, was seen as less disruptive at this G20. His protectionism views maybe not as prominent, and that allowed for a final communique from the summit, which didn't happen at a meeting with Asian leaders 2 weeks ago. How did they achieve that this time? Did they sidestep some issues getting there?
Well, I mean, the big thing is, of course, the Americans are now off to the side on climate change. So you had 19 of 20 leaders agreeing on that, whereas the U.S. is outside the shop. Because you had the headline ceremony or attempted ceremony with China and Mexico about the revised NAFTA, you didn't get a break, a falling apart between allies over that. Donald Trump was muted for two reasons. One is there really wasn't any space for him to take the lead at this summit, apart from possibly the talks with China. And secondly, because he's rattled about what's happening back home, which is the Trump-Russia investigation.
Scott Lucas, we always appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Ahead, more on the two who were political rivals at one time but ended up becoming longtime friends.
Presidents H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton shared something special. We'll have more on their unlikely friendship next. Served in World War II, the oldest living president in U.S. history, and the patriarch of an American political dynasty.
He led the United States through tumultuous times, the first Gulf War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the demise of the Soviet Union. Mr. Bush dedicated his life to public service.
Memorial services begin on Monday when he lies in state at the Capitol building. On Wednesday, a national day of mourning. Family, friends, and dignitaries will gather for a state funeral in Washington. Another funeral will be held Thursday in Houston, where Mr. Bush lived.
One of the most complex and remarkable relationships in President Bush's life was his relationship with the former President Bill Clinton. Despite their political differences, the two developed a strong bond after leaving the White House.
President Clinton wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post Saturday calling his relationship with the man he succeeded one of the great gifts of his life. CNN's Suzanne Malveaux has more about it from Houston.
President George W. Bush often jokes calling President Bill Clinton his brother from another mother because of their close relationship, but also with his father as well. It was a bitter fight back in 1992, and essentially it was Bush Sr. who called President Clinton at the time during that race a bozo. It was also his son later who would publicly criticize Clinton, saying that he would usher in a new era into the White House, one with integrity, that being a reference to Bill Clinton's scandal and impeachment that actually had haunted him. And so they were very critical of him. But then something happened, something changed, and that was George W. Bush's victory in 2000, that controversial victory. Just days afterwards, he reached out to President Bill Clinton. The two of them had a lunch, 90 minutes or so, in Washington. They both ate a bit of humble pie, we are told, and buried the hatchet. And then it just grew from there. And one of the key things that happened was he asked and tasked both President Clinton and his father to try to come up with, in February of 2005, a relief effort for the tsunami that hit Southeast Asia, killing tens of thousands of people, a massive effort, and whether or not they'd be able to raise money as well. They were able to raise millions and millions of dollars in that effort. This was just after, shortly after his first term. And then months later is when Katrina hit. That was in late August. And again, he tasked his father and President Clinton to try to raise private donations to try to help out in that relief effort. At the time, he was undergoing a great deal of criticism for his administration's slow response to Hurricane Katrina. Those two presidents sat down with me at the White House at the time and defended his administration.
There are some people at the New Orleans Convention Center who say that they have been living like animals. No food, no water, no power. And they are the ones who are saying, where are the buses? Where are the planes? Why did it take 3 days to see a real federal response here? Mr. Bush, you, whether it's fair or not, had gone through some administration criticism about your handling of Hurricane Andrew.
I sure did.
Do you believe that this is legitimate?
Yes, I do.
what happened. We all side with not legitimate. I believe that they ought not to be as upset, but I can understand why they are. I believe the administration is doing the right thing, and I believe they have acted in timely fashion. And I understand the people being critical. That happens all the time. And I understand some people wanting to make, a little difficulty by criticizing the president and the team. But I don't want to sit here and not defend the administration, which in my view has taken all the right steps. And they're facing problems that nobody could foresee. The breaking of the levees and the whole dome thing over in New Orleans coming apart. People couldn't foresee that.
Yeah, I think that's important to point out, because when you say, well, they should have done this, that, or the other thing first,